We might as well jump right into it because we got a lot to talk about tonight, obviously, on the federal level, and we can talk about California as well. Before we hopped on, we were talking about how poorly California is doing as well in terms of education. But this has become sort of the new trending topic now that President Trump has been elected. The idea of abolishing the Department of Education. It's something he has promised to work on. I don't think it's as simple as him snapping his fingers, but, I've read some articles about how they can go about kind of dismantling the Department of Education. But I think you would have more insight into what that would look like and what does that mean if we're getting rid of the Department of Education on the federal level.
So a little bit of history on this. I actually spent a better part of last week just researching this issue because there's been a lot of conversation. And I've been a proponent for years, probably decades, about getting rid of the Department of Education. It was one of these things where in 1909, President Jimmy Carter had promised the National Education Association, one of the largest teachers unions out there, that he would ensconce in D.C. an official Department of Education, have a secretary and make it official. And so they passed laws in 1979. Well, of course, all that kind of came to pass as Ronald Reagan's coming into office afterwards. But what I found interesting was that's not the first Department of Education that happened in the country. There was a previous Democratic president, Andrew Johnson, in 1867, who had done the same thing, but it didn't last that long because everybody realized it was a bad idea. And so yeah, it existed for a short period of time, and then they basically got rid of it. They had this office. And so it was it was housed in different departments, Department of the Interior and other places. And so when Jimmy Carter did it, this is as the federal government really is growing in terms of entitlements and in terms of, bureaucrats, and the bureaucracy is just massive. And as that's all happening, you have a department that will not go away. And so they, of course, have to bring things upon themselves and start piling responsibilities and programs and how do we help poor school districts and the such. I can understand the impetus to have a federal conversation about education. What I don't understand is how you can justify it through the Constitution of the United States. There's nowhere in the Constitution that talks about having education or education being a primary responsibility of the federal government.
Right.
And in fact, it pretty much says, all the things that aren't discussed in here should go back to the states and then to the locals, right? So if you look at the whole Department of Education, it is a huge fiction that's created to support a mob. And the mob is the teachers union. And there is no other reason to have the Department of Education except to hire 4,400 bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., tell everybody else what to do, but not teach a single individual child. And so when President Trump comes out with this is not original to him. This has been talked about for decades, literally. You're correct. It is not going to be a snap of the fingers and it's all done. There are some things you have to peel back and roll back. However, he has a mandate. And with the new Congress, both in the Senate and the House, I think they're going to move fast on some of these things. And when you've got a guy like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy who have said they're going to come in and dismantle the federal government, I can see some big changes happening fairly quickly. In the I don't want to say it was like the 1860s, and the decades may be off, but in England, there was a problem with the corn laws they had that were really impeding the ability for people to agriculture and farmers and people to eat. Parliament came in and basically wiped out all the laws and started from scratch. And a lot of people said, well, you just can't do that. Well, they did it. And guess what happened? Things improved dramatically. And if you look back a year or so ago, in Argentina, we had the same sort of experiment happen where Javier Milei came in as president. Basically, he had that big, thing. We're just going to rip all those departments away and we can't get rid of them. He did it, but he's like, no, it's going to take some time. They have actually shown that the growth in Argentina is up to 8.5% growth, which is unheard of for a lot of federal governments. Their budget deficit is near the lowest it's ever been. And the country's actually surviving. Not to say that the Department of Education at the federal level in DC is going to have the same sort of simplistic, deconstruction. But I honestly am in the camp that it's not that complicated. And if it really has to be, we could talk more about this too, about like, how would you do it? I would just simply say year one, year two, All the funding that goes into it's going to stay the same, not going to change. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to block grant per kid in the schools, all the states, whatever money would have gone into the Department of Education and gone out of it. And then basically you turn it over to the state departments of education and you tell the bureaucrats there, we're not going to give you a raise. We're not going to, prolong your contract. In a year or two, you're gone. So you might as well find another job. But this can be done literally with an AI program. You plug in the money coming in, you plug in the money going out for 2 years. You just block grant everything. And yeah, you wouldn't shut it down immediately. You could still work out the kinks and the other laws that are attached to the funding. But it would give you a runway to do it. That's not immediate. It doesn't happen in, January or February of next year. But it also says to people, listen, we're not being careless here. We've just decided we're not going to do this stuff in DC anymore. You're going to have to take care of it in Sacramento, Salt Lake City, Austin, whatever capital you have, and it's not going to happen in DC.
There was an article I was reading from the Washington Examiner, and it was a quote from Frederick M. Hess. He's a senior fellow, director of education policy for American Enterprise.
Smart dude.
He described the Department of Education as, quote, the Department of Education extraordinarily bureaucratic. It creates extraordinary amounts of red tape for the nation's schools, especially relative to the money it actually provides. He says that under the Obama-Biden administration, the department's become a political entity frequently engaged in promoting particular ideological nostrums, which he calls massively problematic. It seems like the Department of Education is not actually worried about education as much as it should be. It seems like it's more worried about forcing an ideology from the top down to schools in the states, right?
Are you even surprised?
Yeah, no, not surprised at all. There was a futurist, his name was Jerry Purnell years ago. He wrote what he called the iron law bureaucracy, and I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's my favorite thing. He basically said there are two groups inside of bureaucracy. There's the people that believe in the end or the purpose of that bureaucracy. And the second group is the people that believe in the bureaucracy itself. And in the end, group number two always wins. And that's where we are right now. We're in the final death breathing of the Department of Education. It has not functionally been an education department at all. It's been a very much a treat and a treasure to the teachers unions. And so I actually wrote a piece this last week, again, when I was doing my research, basically trying to convince Democrats and progressives that getting rid of the department would actually further their goals, right? If you have $250 billion, which is how much money goes through the Department of Education every year. Now that's in grants and scholarships and other stuff too, but $250 billion that doesn't have to go through the hands of 4,400 bureaucrats, thousands of miles away, but it can go straight to you and your bargaining unit. Again, appealing to their senses. Why would you not want that more money coming to you, And again, I'm not saying that we should waste that money or just throw it at the unions. What I'm saying is, why would anybody justify a federal Department of Education at all when it doesn't produce any outcomes? And in fact, if you look over the last, almost 50 years that it's been in place, the decline in test scores is pretty downward, fairly consistent downward trajectory. And so if more money, more federal intervention is supposed to improve things, right? No Child Left Behind by President Bush. It's all gamesmanship. So why perpetuate that? Why not bring that money back to the locals and let the unions hash it out with their people in California rather than argue with some bureaucrat who's going to give you pennies on the dollar instead?
Well, that goes to two of my favorite principles that I stand by are localism and competition. And the idea that people closest to those constituents know what's best for those constituents. So the idea that someone in DC knows what Montana students need is crazy to me when people in Montana know what people in Montana need, or even, filtering down farther and farther to school boards. And this idea of, well, if we stop having a overarching department federally and let the states try out things on their own, it becomes this kind of like state laboratory where maybe one state tries a different way of doing education and it works really well. And the other states look at it and go, oh, that's working really well. Maybe we try it. Or, it creates this sense of competition and creativity where states then get the ability to go, okay, we're not burdened by this overarching federal bureaucracy. We can now do what we need to do and see if it works.
Especially in a state like California, so big and so diverse. It feels like each county school board, like, they know what's best for their students, because like I'm in Orange County and I know that could differ greatly from where Phil is in San Diego, and then you're up north, and I'm sure it's just a whole different ballpark of each school district, even within San Diego County and Orange County. And it feels like what you're describing is kind of along the lines of shop local. It saves, it cuts down all this time and expenses if you shop local. And that's such an encouragement thing that we've heard over the last several years, shop local so that you can, the money goes into these businesses and you save this time and this money and this packaging and like go green and all that. It feels like we'd be packaging it that way, like dismantling the Department of Education would be.
So this is kind of like the Green New Deal, right?
Yeah.
Where we're saving on, all these costs for transporting, education from the federal, seat of government to our local school districts. Another thing that's interesting too is, and back to your point, Phil, competition is real as a component of education proficiency. If we want to have academic excellence, you don't get that by having the status quo or by putting kids on a conveyor belt in a warehouse and just push and go, right? You've got to, every kid's different. I have 5 kids. All 5 of my kids are different. My oldest is not like my second, it's not like my third, fourth, or fifth. They're just different. And so what might work for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 might not work for the 5th, right? And so even within households, you've got to have some sort of competitive mechanism, because that's important. 1992, California was the second state in the nation to put forward the model of charter schools. They decided that rather than appeal to a lot of the parents that were tired of what was happening in the public schools and were pulling their kids out to homeschool them, the teachers union freaked out and they said, okay, well, we're going to do something, we'll do like a hybrid, right? It's not really private school, it's not homeschool, but it's not really our traditional neighborhood public schools. We'll do charter schools and see if that experiment works. We'll give charter schools some freedoms. They don't have to negotiate with teachers unions, a little less bureaucracy, but we're only going to give them 75 cents on the dollar to do their job. We'll see how this works out. So actually, homeschooling kind of slowed down at that point in time. Charter schools grew pretty dramatically. But if you fast forward 30 years from 1992, so it was right after the invention of the Department of Education in 79. But you fast forward 32 years in 2022, when I was running for school superintendent, what we found is that charter schools were actually doing really well. And the teachers unions hated it. And they hated it during COVID because a lot of parents were frustrated they couldn't get their kids in schools. So they thrown them to charter schools. So the legislature went and basically said, okay, this is what we're going to do. Not only are we only going to keep giving you just 75 cents on the dollar, but we're not going to give you any additional dollars from the money we gave you this year in case you get more students next year. This will prohibit schools from accepting more kids because you can only decrease your marginal cost so much. And so they actually handicap these charter schools. That's the sort of bureaucracy right now that we have in DC. Anything that is good or promising or, that might work in the local districts, DC is going to find a way to handicap or to kneecap people. And that's exactly what they do. So the sooner we get rid of that department, the more abilities that local districts will have to experiment, to do different things, to compete with each other. And there's other reforms we could do that are short of like an education savings account that would allow parents to actually, go between school districts and try different things. Competition will help us find our way out of this education malaise, to take a phrase from Jimmy Carter, but it won't happen unless and until we don't have to ask mommy may I for everything we want in DC.
Hey, thanks for checking out the California Underground podcast. If you enjoyed that clip, make sure you subscribe, like, share, review, comment, all that stuff that helps with the algorithm, helps people find us more. And if you want to learn more, you can always listen to our full podcast at Apple, Spotify, Google, all those different places that you basically find podcasts. Or if you just want to keep watching clips, you can check out clips here. or you can subscribe to our channel right here, somewhere in here.